You're listening to The Hikam with Shaykh Zahir Bacchus of the Lotri Foundation. In this podcast, Shaykh Zahir explains the aphorisms from Ibn Ata'illah's famous book of wisdoms, Al-Hikam Al-Ata'iyah, a classical manual of spiritual development. Visit seekershub.org for online courses, our reliable answer service, and engaging media.
Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. Wa sallallahu ala Sayyidina Muhammadin wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. اللهم علمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما علمتنا وزدنا علما بفضلك وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم آمين. We're on this in the Hikam of Ibn Ata'illah. We reach number 67. And as all the previous ones that we've been talking about so far in this particular chapter, he's been talking about the servant and how they view their worship and how they view themselves and how they interact with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, especially those who are trying to improve themselves daily, or they're trying to improve themselves every moment. Every moment they're trying to get better in terms of their practice to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Not in terms of, it may not be in terms of their of increase in their practice, but in terms of their quality of their practice, in the amount that they worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, in the quality that they worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, how they feel after they finish worshipping or after they finish a certain act of ibadah, a certain act of worship to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So he says, إِذَا رَأَيْتَ عَبْدًا أَقَامَ اللَّهُ بِوُجُودِ الْأَوْرَادِ وَأَدَامَهُ عَلَيْهَا مَعْتُولَ الْإِمْدَادِ فَلَا تَسْتَحْقِرَنَّ مَا مَنَهُ مَوْلَاهُ لأنك لم ترى عليه سيم العارفين ولا بهجة المحبين فلولا وارد ما كان ورد. So he says, Ibn Ata'illah, he talks about there's a couple of concepts in here. So he says, إذا رأيت عبدا أقام الله بوجود الأوراد, that when you see a servant of Allah, when you see a servant whom Allah has established in regular worship. The wujud al-awrad. Awrad is anything that one puts forth to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, salah, zakat, fasting, recitation of Quran, sadaqah, anything that one puts forth, it's considered awrad, especially when it's regular. When it's regular, it's a wird. You've made a wird, going to the masjid to pray the prayers. If one has determined that whenever you can and it's possible, that you'll make every effort to go to the masjid to pray in congregation, this becomes what you have determined in yourself to do. It is a wird that you have regularly started, that you've determined it. You come to the mosque and you want to read a quarter of a juz. That's something that you have determined that you'll put the effort to do. So it becomes a regular. So when he says, when you see a servant whom Allah has established, Allah has established him in regular worship. He says, he said, do not undervalue the gift, because do not undervalue. لا تستخرن, do not undervalue the gift that Allah has given to him, even if you do not see the mark of the knowers of Allah nor the glow of Allah on him, because Allah subhanahu has established him in regular devotion, and Allah subhanahu has he's been established in it, and Allah has given him blessings in it. Tul al-amdad, Allah has provided blessings. There's the blessings, the gifts that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given to him that comes down to him. So he says, if you do not see the mark of the knowers of Allah on him, the arifin, and nor the glow of the lovers of Allah, those who love Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, muhibbeen, their category that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks about in the Quran, the muhibbeen, the ones who He loves, and those who love Him. If you do not see the signs of this, if you do not see the signs, He says, don't dismay of them. Do not undervalue them. Do not be in lowering them, or mocking them, or disparaging of them. Do not do anything like this. If you see people, or you see servants of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because then he says, فَلَوْلَا وَارِدٌ مَا كَانَ وِرْدٌ. So he says, if it was not for fruits from Allah that came, they would not be able to worship. If it was not for the fruits that Allah has given to them, or His help, in other words, if it was not for the warid, meaning Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala inspiration, if it was not for Allah inspiring them and granting them blessings and giving them that spiritual help, that ilham, or whatever comes from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, if it was not for Allah's divine help, they would not have put forth to be regular in worship. So it came from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It came from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So even if you do not see the effects of worship on a person, even if you do not see the effects of the worship on a person, it does not mean that Allah has not granted him or her gifts. Allah has granted gifts to them simply because He's given them and forwarded to them He's forwarded them the inspiration. He's inspired them to worship Him. That inspiration has come from Him, from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Because the inspiration has come from Him, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that is the fruits. That is the fruit. Or that is the gift from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's the gift of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Someone may worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for a long time, a very long time. And this is how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala hides. Sometimes Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala hides the goodness of people. He hides them so that one does not recognize one person from another. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sometimes conceals the people of goodness. He sometimes conceals them. Why? Why does Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala do this? Why does Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala conceal it and sometimes blinds us to seeing it, so that we do not judge one to another? That's why. So that we consider that everyone who we see as a believer to be a person who is above us. That everyone that we see is someone who we should consider to be above us. As we said yesterday, you look at people through the eyes of rahmah. The ulama, they say you look at people, believers, you look at believers through the eyes of mercy. And you look at yourself through the eyes of the law of Sharia. This safeguards your heart against what? It safeguards your heart against disparaging of believers, which is a sin. It's a sin to disparage, to mock believers. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us, لَا يَسْخَرُ قَوْمٍ عَنِ الْقَوْمٍ عَسَىٰ أَن يَكُونُوا خَيْرًا مِّنْهُمْ Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, كما قال Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in Hujurat, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that perhaps you should do not disparage, mock one people to another, one qawm, one group should not mock another group. Why? Because perhaps the group that is being mocked is better than the one who are mocking. This is from the Quran. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us that is a point of adab. That ayah safeguards what? What does that ayah safeguards you against? It safeguards your heart. That's what it safeguards. And it safeguards your heart against what, precisely? It safeguards your heart from arrogance. That's what it safeguards. That ayah, if you apply it, and you apply it to yourself. If you apply it to yourself, what then does it safeguard you against? It safeguards you against from becoming prideful and arrogant. It safeguards you against thinking that you are better than someone else. It safeguards your heart against having kibr in it, becoming pride, having that the trait of pride or boasting. Safeguards against that. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He doesn't want the believers to disparage of other believers. So when you look at people, if you look, we see one another on a daily basis. We see one another, we see other believers, and so on and so forth. A believer may be practicing their entire life, and we may see them and recognize them as believers. The Prophet ﷺ, he says, know that one is a believer when you see them going back and forth from the masjid. Isn't that true? It's a hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, يُمُرُّ مِنَ الْمَسْجِدِ, that when you know that he is a believer, the Prophet ﷺ said, when you see them going back and forth from the masjid. See them going back from the masjid. Know that they are a believer because of the effort that they are striving and making, the effort that they are involved with. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the Prophet ﷺ in that hadith, that's all we need to know, is that they are a believer. And once they are a believer, then they have our right. They have rights upon us. Some hadith it's 5 rights, some hadith it's 6 rights. The rights of returning their salam, raddu salam. The right of visitation of when they're sick, iyadatul murid. The right of janazah, of praying at their janazah. They have rights. The right of returning, of saying yarhamukumullah when they sneeze. These are rights that are laid down. Once we know that they are believers, then they have rights over us. They have rights over us that we have to fulfill. There's rights that we have to fulfill. Or some has to fulfill it in some cases. That then is enough to tell us what this hikmah here, Ibn Ata'illah, what does it help us to understand? It helps us to understand our own place. That's what it helps us to understand. It helps us to understand our own place, that we do works and we do ibadat. We do works and we do ibadat. The effects of it comes from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. How we're affected by the ibadah, it comes from Allah. One of the effects that comes is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives us the ability to continue in that worship. That's one of the effects. One of the effects and it is one of the greatest of the effects. One of the greatest gifts that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives to us is not just the fact that He's inspired us to pray a singular prayer, or that He allows us to read a singular ayah on a particular day. The gift from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is that He gives you that He gifts to you what? The wanting to continue to pray, to come to the next prayer, to read the next verse, to memorize the next verse, to give a further sadaqah the next day. That is a gift from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's the gift. Whether you realize the effects of it or not, whether you realize it or not, that's the gift. The gift and it's a great gift that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has allowed you to go to be inspired to perform a next good work after you finish doing a good work. That's a gift from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Someone should not look at, well, I've been praying and I should feel a certain way, or I should look a certain way, or I should be a certain way, or people should recognize me in a certain way, or whatnot. No, that may not necessarily be what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala brings, because the effects of your worship is what Allah wants to bring to you. The effects of worship is what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will determine for you. You cannot determine it yourself. The effects of your worship cannot be determined by yourself. It is determined by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The effects of your worship will be determined by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so he puts it in the case of what? إِذَا رَأَيْتَ عَبْدًا, if you see a servant, when you see a slave, when you see a slave. That, obviously, one of the adab is that we don't look at one another and judge. One of the adab of the believer is that we don't look and we don't judge. We don't look and we don't judge. So why does he say, إِذَا رَأَيْتَ عَبْدًا أَقَامُ اللَّهُ بِوُجُودِ الْأَوْرَادِ? Why does he say that? Shaykh ibn Ata'illah, why does he say this? When he knows we don't look and we don't judge. He knows the servant of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, those who are striving in his path, do not look at others. It's to reflect on ourselves. It's a reflection on ourselves. It is a reflection on ourselves that we don't know. That we don't know who is closer to Allah than others. Sometimes Allah lets us know. We know some of the ulama, we see light, nur, in their faces and so on and so forth. Sometimes Allah allows us to see. Sometimes He allows us to see. Sometimes He doesn't. Sometimes Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not allow us to see. And so, what does Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala want? Do not find insignificant the state of others. Do not find insignificant the state of others and judge believers depending on how you want to judge them. No, leave them. Their judgment is to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. How they are is to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. How they are to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that should give us joy. So we don't disparage of one another, put one another down. Every believer is sacred to one another. Every believer is sacred to one another. The fact of the matter is, we ourselves, we don't know if our own actions are accepted. Perhaps the one that you disparage, his action is accepted, or her action is accepted before yours. Perhaps the one that you disparage gets into Jannah before you. Perhaps they are the reason why you get into Jannah, because they will ask Allah to enter you into Jannah, even though you have disparaged of them. So don't consider insignificant the state because you do not see the mark of the knowers of Allah, which includes that, they have left their own desires and they're free from the minor sins and so on and so forth. or they're splendour, the lovers of Allah, meaning that they have adab, and they are pleased all the time with their Lord, and you can see it. You can see it. If you believe that every believer is sacred in the eyes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then what happens? What is a sign of knowing that a believer is sacred in your eyes? What happens? What happens is that A, you don't disparage of them. B, that you do not think ill of them. Do not think ill of them. C, that you treat them like you treat every other believer. And D is that you have love for them like every other believer. That you have love for them like every other believer. The Prophet ﷺ, Umar ibn Khattab radiallahu anhu, he asked the Prophet ﷺ once, he asked him that he wanted to go do Umrah. Umar ibn Khattab radiallahu anhu, he asked the Prophet ﷺ, he said to him, he says, I want to go make Umrah. أردت أن أعمر. So the Prophet ﷺ, he says to him, go. And he says to him, he says, Ya akhi, before he left, the Prophet ﷺ, he turned to him and he said, Ya akhi, he said, oh my brother, لا تنسونا من دعائك. Do not forget us in your dua. لا تنساني من دعائك. Do not forget me in your dua. And Umar al-Khattab, he became so overjoyed. He became so overjoyed that he never forgot. He said these words that the Prophet ﷺ spoke were the most happiest words the words that made him the most happiest. That's what he said. He said the words of the Prophet ﷺ spoke. Those words, oh my brother, do not forget me in your dua. He said they were the most happiest words that he ever heard. Why? Because the Prophet ﷺ asked him to make dua for him. The Prophet ﷺ asked him. That asking of him making dua for him, what did it do? It elevated his status and his rank. This was the khushu, the humbleness of the Prophet. This was the humbleness of the Prophet. The humbleness of the Prophet put the rank of Umar ibn Khattab above his own rank. Because that's what you do. When you ask someone to make dua for you, what are you doing? You are putting their rank above your rank. That's what you're doing. At the end of the day, you are putting their rank above your own rank. This is what the Prophet ﷺ demonstrated to us. He demonstrated humility and humbleness to other servants of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this is what his teacher, this is what we have to learn from this hikmah. Learn that everyone is sacred in the eyes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Someone may think that they practice better. They may think that they know more. They may think whatever they want to think. Doesn't mean anything. When you stand before Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that's when everything will be known. Your rank will be known when you stand before Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Your rank will be known. And if you disobey the command of Allah in the Quran by disparaging of other believers, you will stand before your Lord and you'll have to face up to it. All of us will stand before Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one who will judge us accordingly. And so don't disparage of others. Don't lower the rank of others. Don't lower the rank of others. Because we don't know what their fate is. And we don't know of their rank. We don't know of their rank. And it could be that someone is close to their Lord, because that's what Allah has determined for them. But there is no sign of that closeness in them. Could be no sign of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's closeness in them. That's because Allah conceals it. Allah has concealed it. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has concealed it. And so those who want highness with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, just look into yourself and correct it. And the ulama, they say, if one busy themselves with themselves, they will not be busy themselves with other people. If one busy themselves with themselves, they will not have time to look at others, or they will not have time to look at the faults of others, because they are on the process of correcting themselves. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala help us, guide us, forgive us, have mercy upon us, forgive our elders, our parents, give them good health, long life. Those who have passed away, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala grant them His mercies, maghfirah, and His shade. Those who are faced with illnesses and sickness, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala heal them, bring them to proper remedy. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala nurse them back to good health, keep them on the path of healthiness. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala protect our children, keep them on a straight path, make their footing firm in His deen. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala increase us in knowledge and practice of our deen. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, those who are faced with difficulties, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala remove those difficulties, bring ease to them, give them patience to deal with their difficulties, help them to persevere through them. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala protect us and protect our families, protect our children, and protect our loved ones, and protect our ummah. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make our homes amongst the homes of the believers, and make our last words our very best words. Subhanaka wa hamdik, shadu an la ilaha illa ant, astaghfiruka wa atubu ilayk, wa sallallahu ala sayyidina Muhammadin wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam.
Thank you for listening to The Hikam with Shaykh Zahir Bacchus. Help Seekers Hub spread the light of guidance to millions around the world by supporting us through monthly donations by going to seekershub.org/donate. Your donations are tax deductible in the US and Canada.